Welcome to the Security Weekly News wrap-up for the week of 8 May 2022. DEA hacked, SideWinder, memory bugs, U.S. bioeconomy, and Russian cyber threat. All this and show wrap-ups on the Security Weekly News.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals.
We interrupt our program to bring you this important message.
It's the show that keeps you up to date on the latest security news twice a week. Your trusted source for accurate security information and expert analysis. It's time for Security Weekly News. Cybercriminals are working overtime. Last year in the fourth quarter alone, phishing attacks disguised as COVID testing information increased by 521%. Barracuda has identified 13 types of email threats and how cybercriminals use them to steal money from your company or personal information from your employees and customers. Find out about the 13 email threat types and how Barracuda can provide complete email protection for your teams, your customers, and your reputation. Get your free ebook at securityweekly.com/Barracuda. That's securityweekly.com/Barracuda. Monitoring and maintaining compliance is a never-ending struggle with a high price of failure. Firemon helps customers meet complex and varying compliance requirements. Firemon has fully customizable reporting, analytics, assessments, and dashboards to meet the compliance needs of any organization. With Firemon, compliance reports take a tenth of the time, and real-time continuous compliance eliminates the anxiety and headaches of audit preparation. Improve security outcomes by improving security operations with Firemon. Visit securityweekly.com/Firemon to learn more.
Hey, as you may have noticed, Doug White is not here with us this week. I'm Jason Wood, covering for Doug on this week's Security Weekly News wrap-up, show episode 212. Doug asked me to tell everybody that he misses you all, but he's off at a goat yoga retreat this weekend while living in a yurt and doing burning coal crawls, kind of to, prove their capability of mind over matter. And I just want to cheer Doug on and say, hey, if you don't mind the third degree burns, they don't matter that much. So the show wrap-ups for this week on Application Security Weekly, episode 196, John and Mike talked with Christoph Nagy, the CEO of Security Bridge. Christoph was on to talk about the security needs of SAP systems. And as you can imagine, SAP installations are extremely complex and highly customized to each customer and the organization, how their business uses it. So Christoph was discussing some of the challenges in protecting SAP and really how to address those. In the second segment of Application Security Weekly News, they covered the AppSec news as normal. On Business Security Weekly, episode 262, Ben, Jason, and Matt had Mike Ernst, the VP of Sales at ExtraHop Networks, on the show. The topic for their discussion was cyber, the fifth domain of war, which sounds pretty impressive. They kicked off their discussion really talking about the guidance and the warning that had been released by CISA in regards to Russia's invasion of the Ukraine and warning to organizations in Western countries. And they dove right into, in their discussion, about the worries that occurred early on in the war, talked about how things have mostly been business as usual in the U.S. and other countries, but then went on to discuss that, this is not time to let our guard down either. In the second segment, the Business Security Weekly News as normal. On Enterprise Security Weekly, episode 273, Paul, Matt, Katie, and Lee had Yasser Rashid, Global Director of Enterprise Client Sales at Intel, on the show. Yasser was on to discuss the vPro platform by Intel and how customers can use it to manage and update an entire host, basically from firmware to OS drivers and OS patches. A lot of ground to be able to cover in just a single platform like that. In the second segment, Omer Tehran, the CEO or the co-founder and CTO rather of CyberReady, joined the show. Their discussions, they started off talking about security awareness training, some of the failings that are occurring there, in typical security awareness training, and really kind of how it comes into conflict with, the advice it gives us versus what's going on in our lives, and how phishing messages and things like that play on those events in our lives. Kind of like that package that you were expecting, but apparently isn't going to be coming according to this phishing email I just got. So Omer had some an interesting point that security awareness training focuses on the theory of what people should do and doesn't actually help people practice when there's to spot malicious messages. So spent some time talking about building up that experience level. The third segment of Enterprise Security Weekly News, they also continued on with the latest news there. On Security Weekly News, episode number 211, some guy named Jason Wood talked about the U.S. Treasury Department leveling sanctions against a cryptocurrency mixing service named Blender. These sanctions are a first to face, as far as these types of services, facing sanctions from the Treasury Department, and they did drop some hints that they may not be the last to face that. So I thought it was kind of interesting. I don't know, anytime you get around cryptocurrency mixers, this is something I just find to be kind of wild. On Paul's Security Weekly, episode 740, Fleming Shi, CTO of Barracuda Networks, joined Paul, Larry, Josh, and Matt for the first segment of the show. Fleming came on to talk about destructive malware. And one of the points that they talked about that I thought was kind of a little alarming was the idea of having some malware coming in and wrecking one organization and then pivoting on the trust connections to another organization to basically go after that, a second or third, et cetera, organization. That would make for a heck of a nightmare. In the second segment of Paul's Security Weekly, they covered the news. One item I found to be interesting was North Carolina passing a law that prohibits public entities, government entities, from paying ransoms. Now, it's only government entities, not businesses, but I thought that would be interesting to see how it plays out when one of these agencies are hit with a ransomware attack and are trying to figure out how to recover. And with that, let's take a look at the latest news as we wrap up this week. The U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency, or DEA, announced yesterday that they are investigating a breach into a portal that has connection to 16 different law enforcement databases. The portal is called the Law Enforcement Inquiry and Alerts application, or LEA, and the intruder was able to access it because they had credentials, legitimate credentials, for an authorized user to the system. Oops. I expect the person who was issued that account is having a really bad time about that right now. According to an article published by Brian Krebs, the portal basically has sensitive data and that is considered anywhere from classified to law enforcement sensitive and mission sensitive to the DEA. According to Nicholas Weaver, a researcher for the Computer Science Institute at the University of California, Berkeley, the screenshots of the portal access appear to indicate that intruders are not only able to view sensitive data, but they can add data to the system. Weaver speculated that the drug cartels in particular would pay quite a bit of money for this type of access because this would allow them to put information into the portal about rivals and basically, have a way of outing them and, turning the heat up on their rivals. So, that was kind of a little bit of a look at that. In a fun twist, the current owner of DocSpin contacted Krebs basically to provide the screenshots of the access to the LEA portal. And the interesting part, I guess, was where the previous owner of DocSpin has been identified as the leader of Lapsus. Are they related? Well, I don't know. Krebs spent about 3 paragraphs tying them together a little bit, basically due to members of Lapsus filing fake emergency data requests, where their law enforcement sends a request to data to some kind of service provider or technology company saying they need access to something. So Krebs made the comment that this type of access would be a huge win to the Lapsus group because they would have all kinds of information that they could use in that. My first thought is probably the same as yours. Really, when you took the cause of the breach, it only requires a username and password for access. with data this sensitive, and it's hanging out on the internet. Come on, folks. This has to be done better. Next up is a report on Wired about the hidden race, and this is a quote, hidden race to protect the U.S. bioeconomy from hacker threats. My first thought was, what the heck is the bioeconomy? Is it an underground market for selling body parts for transplants or something like that? It turns out that this is actually just a reference to biological research that goes into biotech and is used by a lot of different industries. The underlying theme of the story really isn't that unusual in of itself. Basically, bioresearch is an important part of industries in agriculture, medicine, energy, and more. So you've got valuable area of research that lots of small organizations are involved in that could have a dramatic impact on human life. One of the examples that Charles Fascia, I guess, who is the co-founder of a cybersecurity nonprofit named Bioeconomy Information Sharing and Analysis Center, that he gave was Moderna. It's now famous for providing one of the main vaccines that we use in the U.S. and other countries for the response against COVID-19. Moderna only started 12 years ago, has been a fairly small organization for quite a while of that, and was doing research into mRNA vaccines from the beginning. Fascia basically stated, imagine if Moderna got hacked 4 years ago, even with some totally non-sophisticated malware, or they faced a ransomware attack. Small companies can go bankrupt really easily, and then we lose the work that they're doing for the future, end quote. The point basically here being is Moderna came up with one of the vaccines that made a large difference in the United States as far as our response to COVID-19. But if they had gone bankrupt, 4 years ago or something like that, due to some kind of ransomware attack, we wouldn't have the benefit of their work later on. The article's worth checking out. It's discussed the what's going on with the BioISAC, as the Fascia's organization was shortened up to, in protecting small biotech companies. On a more typical security note, Intel has announced a high-risk bug in its firmware for some Intel Optane SSD and Intel Optane data center products that can allow privilege escalation, denial of service, or information disclosure. The Optane memory in these devices is basically installed between the processor and storage devices on systems, and it's also used to store things that it decides are commonly used bits of data and programs, move them closer to the processor, improve the performance of the overall system. With this code residing in this particular location, as you can imagine, it's highly important to get the protections around this correct, and has access to a lot of data that's passing back and forth. So this is a bit of a problem here for us to deal with. Intel has released firmware updates for the affected devices, and Dell and HP have released patches to their customers as well. For organizations that use CVSS scores as a hard line for how quickly they're going to patch an issue, this has been rated a 7, so this should meet most thresholds to get this rolled out quickly. So let's get to the patching on this one. Nushin Shaba, a senior researcher at Kaspersky, presented at Black Hat Asia the other day about an APT group known as SideWinder, aka TAPT 04, aka Rattlesnake, aka Razor Tiger. Their activities really over the last 2 years in Asia. According to Shaba's research, SideWinder has been extremely active, with nearly 1,000 targeted intrusions credited to them against entities in Asia, which is probably why we haven't heard too much of them here in the U.S. It's happening somewhere else. Their main targets appear to be primarily military and law enforcement organizations in Pakistan, Bangladesh, and other South Asian countries. Shaba spoke of their persistence in particular, and was quoted as saying, even if the target has suspected that a previous attempt was had malicious intentions, like spear phishing emails and so on, the threat actor has tried to use a new infection vector and use a new domain to try their luck over and over. So, end quote. They basically have taken to heart the advice that at first you don't succeed, to try again. The group doesn't appear to be overly sophisticated. They don't depend on 0 days or any kind of crazy research. They do have large infrastructure and just a high volume attacks that they will use in that. They don't use 0 days. They lean heavily on known vulnerabilities in Windows, Microsoft Office, and Android, and basically use malware-infected documents and phishing messages to try and gain access to their targets. SideWinder has been around for about 10 years, but it's really the last 2 years where they've ratcheted up the volume of their attacks. There's some speculation as to why that is. Why did they suddenly increase their pace over the last 2 years? But apparently they are trying to bold and put underline on the P in APT as far as persistent. And the next article came from Threat Post. And honestly, this reminded me of an old video game that, for whatever reason, that it allowed you to build your own adventure. Years and years ago, a friend of mine had what was called the Adventure Construction Set back when I was in junior high school, and he would tell me about what he and another friend were up to in the game. Apparently, his friend Ivan created what was called the I card, and it had a negative weight value, which would allow Ivan to carry just about any amount of items with him with no restrictions on weight. So, I just kind of like the hacking aspect of that and using the game as an unintended as it really probably wasn't intended to do. Anyhow, the article talks about a Discord user who back in April started advertising that he had created a new password stealing malware builder and was now offering it out there for people to use. The malware builder is kind of like the Adventure Construction Set, except now it allows novices to build malware instead of video game adventures. The malware builder has been titled Cure Stealer by researchers and uses components of different password stealers in its code, basically stuff that was available on GitHub already, but it's been tied up together inside of one application. Where it gets a little bit interesting is it targets Discord itself, in particular a kind of a different client for Discord called Better Discord, and it gets on a system. If Better Discord is running, it looks for the string API/webhooks in the code, replaces that with the word kisses. And if that works, it sees, okay, I've got the access I need. It'll try and set up its own webhooks into Better Discord. And then it begins to go after the machine that it's running on and start looking for passwords that have been stored in various applications, including Microsoft Edge, Chrome, and 18 other applications. This gets sent back up to the attacker. Subtlety was not something that they were particularly interested in. Basically, the source code has reference to their creators, Sulimansha and Portu, and it has an invite to Portu's Discord channel. Now, that Discord channel is apparently emptied out now, but there's some images in there that seems to indicate that Portu is located in Spain. OPSEC? Yeah, we don't know no stinking OPSEC. And finally, last story of the show. The BBC has released a report this week warning organizations that the cyber conflict, in quotes, over Ukraine could spill into other countries still. So it's not time for anybody to relax their guard. Now, as you recall, when Russia invaded the Ukraine, everybody was quite concerned that Russia was going to not only attack the Ukraine, IT systems, they were going to go after everybody else's as well. And that hasn't manifested too much at this point. The article quotes Rob Joyce, the director of cybersecurity at the NSA, repeatedly throughout it. And, it notes that there was, we've had that surprise. We expected more, but it hasn't really been happening. But what they commented on is they've observed that instead of one big massive rush at Ukraine, it's more of a longer term sustained type of attack that's occurring. In fact, Joyce is quoted as saying it wasn't massive attack but there's been a sustained conflict, end quote. The BBC reports that Russia has deployed 8 or 9 different pieces of destructive malware to target Ukrainian systems. And then actually earlier this week on Tuesday, the US, the UK, the EU, and other nations accused Russia of attacking a satellite communications provider that is used by the Ukrainian military, but it's also used by customers in Europe. And so here we have a little bit of a spillover between the two. And hence the protests about this. So while Russia has not yet at this point decided to target countries outside of Ukraine, the concern is this still could escalate. Things could still spill over, particularly if things don't go the way Vladimir Putin prefers that they would, and they haven't yet. So I don't see that changing anytime soon. So it really just kind of remains to be seen whether or not that will spill over eventually, or if it's just going to remain isolated to Ukrainian systems. Again, the whole point is it's just not time to let your guard down yet. And that's the wrap up for the week of 8 May 2022. I'm Jason Wood, and I'll see you next week on Security Weekly News.